The house smelled faintly of lemon polish and dust, a blend of care and abandonment. Margaret stood in the living room, her thin fingers tracing the edges of a frame that had not moved in decades. The family portrait hung heavy on the wall, herself, Harold, and their boy, Daniel. Daniel's smile was still frozen in childhood brightness, though nearly half a century had passed since he vanished into the night. She had told herself for years that the photograph was proof of love. It was the one artifact she could cling to whenever loneliness grew sharp, when the bed grew colder beside her. For nearly 5 decades, she had believed in Harold as her anchor, the man who held her when she wept, the one who promised again and again that love was enough to survive even loss. But loss never softened. It calcified. Margaret's hair, once auburn, now silver, fell around her face as she whispered to the picture, "I did everything right. I kept the faith." Her reflection in the glass looked older, almost ghost-like, as though the house itself had been feeding on her grief. Harold was upstairs, she knew, always retreating into silence. Retirement had not brought them closer. It had carved deeper gaps. He spent hours in his study, claiming to read, though Margaret never heard the rustle of pages. Sometimes she wondered if he was waiting for something or hiding from her. Still, she told herself the truth she had always carried. Marriages are built on endurance, not perfection. She had endured. She had forgiven his silences, his distance, even the occasional sharpness in his tone. Love, she believed, demanded such sacrifices. Yet tonight, as twilight settled and the windows reflected the dim glow of the lamps, Margaret felt something unsettled stir beneath the surface of memory. Her chest tightened, as if a whisper was rising from the old walls. "Are you sure you ever knew him at all?" The grandfather clock chimed, breaking her trance. Harold's footsteps creaked overhead. Tomorrow would mark their 50th anniversary, a milestone most couples never reach. Margaret forced a small smile and turned from the portrait, but the boy's eyes seemed to follow her. She walked toward the dining room, unaware that tomorrow's celebration would splinter the fragile shell of her faith forever. The morning of their 50th anniversary arrived with muted light, the kind of gray dawn that carried neither joy nor sorrow but something in between. Margaret laid out the good china, her hand steady, though her heart quivered with quiet expectation. A golden anniversary was supposed to shimmer, wasn't it? Yet the air felt heavy, as though the house itself anticipated something she could not name. Harold descended the stairs slowly, his once broad frame stooped now with age. He wore the navy suit she had pressed the night before, but his tie hung slightly crooked, his expression unreadable. Margaret offered him a smile, soft and deliberate, but he only nodded. The silence between them stretched until it seemed to press against the walls. At dinner, the candles flickered against polished silverware. Margaret had prepared his favorite roast, though she barely tasted her own plate. She spoke of memories, vacations, small triumphs, the way they once danced in the kitchen when no one was watching. Harold listened but did not respond. His eyes remained fixed on the wine glass he turned slowly in his hand. "Harold," she ventured, her voice careful, "are you thinking about him tonight?" She did not have to say Daniel's name. It lingered always, unspoken yet present. Harold's jaw tightened. "Some things are better left where they belong," he muttered. His tone carried finality but not grief. Margaret's chest chilled. For so many years she had thought his silence was mourning. Now she wondered if it was something else entirely. She studied him closely. His hand trembled when he reached for the bread. His eyes darted toward the window as if searching for escape, restless, uneasy, almost guilty. Margaret pushed the thought away, ashamed for even entertaining it. This was the man she had loved for half a century. Surely his quiet was nothing more than grief resurfacing. Yet as the clock struck 10, Harold abruptly stood, leaving his plate half-finished. "I'm tired," he said, already walking away. Margaret remained at the table, her heart pounding. The roast had gone cold, the wine untouched. She stared at the empty chair across from her and, for the first time in decades, allowed herself to wonder, what really happened the night Daniel disappeared? The silence Harold left at the dinner table followed Margaret into the night. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, memories she had long tried to bury clawing their way back. It was the anniversary, she told herself. That was why Daniel came flooding into her thoughts. But the images were too vivid, too insistent, as though the past demanded to be relived. It had been a summer evening, warm and deceptive in its beauty. Daniel was just 11 then, his hair a sandy tangle, his laughter filling the backyard as fireflies blinked in the dusk. Margaret had called him in for supper. He never answered. She remembered the exact moment her heart stuttered, the certainty, before reason, before denial, that something was wrong. The frantic hours that followed blurred into chaos. Neighbors joined the search, voices calling Daniel's name into the darkness. Margaret remembered running barefoot across wet grass, the sound of her own ragged breathing. Flashlight beam caught on branches and fences, but never on the boy she needed to find. Police cars arrived, their lights painting the house in red and blue. Questions came like blows. When did you last see him? Did he run away? Was there trouble at home? Margaret's voice cracked with every answer. She clung to Harold's arm, trembling, desperate. Harold, by contrast, stood steady. His tone with officers was calm, measured, almost rehearsed. He told them Daniel must have wandered farther than expected, perhaps into the woods, perhaps to a friend's house. His composure became the anchor the police leaned on, and the shield Margaret hid behind. But even then, some part of her had felt the strangeness of it. Father should have broken. A father should have shouted Daniel's name until his throat gave out. Harold did neither. He simply directed the search, his eyes narrowing, his voice low, his movements precise. Days stretched into weeks. Posters with Daniel's face appeared on telephone poles. Reporters gathered at the end of their street, hungry for updates. Margaret's sobs were captured on camera. Harold beside her appeared solemn, dignified. Some praised him for his strength. To Margaret, his stillness felt colder than grief should allow. Now, decades later, lying awake on their anniversary night, she replayed those moments with new suspicion. His calm no longer looked like courage. It looked like something else entirely, something she had refused to name. Downstairs, the old floorboards creaked. Margaret sat up listening, her heart racing. She thought of Harold's restlessness, of the locked study, of the way his eyes had shifted at dinner. For the first time in years, she whispered aloud, "What are you hiding, Harold?" The whisper she had spoken into the dark did not fade with morning. Margaret awoke with the sensation that her house, once familiar, had turned into a stage set, its walls concealing secrets she had been too blind to see. Harold moved through their routines as though nothing had shifted. Breakfast in silence, the newspaper folded just so, his coffee stirred 3 times before he took a sip. But to Margaret, every gesture now seemed deliberate, hiding rather than revealing. It was the study that drew her attention first. Harold had always kept it tidy, filled with shelves of history books and stacks of bills. But now the door stayed locked even during the day. Once when she walked past, she heard the low murmur of his voice, urgent, clipped, as though he were speaking on the telephone. By the time she pressed her ear to the wood, there was only silence. That night, Margaret pretended to sleep. Through half-closed eyes, she watched Harold slip from bed just past midnight. He padded down the hallway, careful, deliberate. The faint glow of a lamp leaked from beneath the study door. She waited, heart pounding, until she heard the muffled click of the lock. The next morning, while Harold tended the garden, Margaret began to search. Guilt burned her cheeks, but suspicion overpowered shame. In the bottom drawer of his dresser, beneath neatly folded shirts, she found a bundle of old letters. The paper was yellowed, the handwriting unfamiliar. She skimmed the first, cryptic lines about keeping quiet, about what must remain buried. Her hands shook as she folded it back, sliding the drawer shut before Harold returned. At dinner, she studied his face. He ate in silence, his fork steady, his eyes never quite meeting hers. For years, she had told herself his distance was grief, that silence was his way of carrying pain. But now, when she searched those eyes, she did not see sorrow. She saw calculation. A stranger seemed to inhabit the man she had once trusted more than anyone. Margaret lay awake again, the ceiling pressing down, her chest tightening with unspoken dread. The letters, the study, the calls, pieces of a puzzle she no longer dared to ignore. She resolved that tomorrow, when Harold left for his weekly errand, she would enter the study. She would open the door that had been locked against her for too long. Whatever lay behind it would tell her whether she had been married to a grieving husband or to a liar all along. The next morning, Harold left for his weekly errands. Margaret watched from the window as his car pulled down the street, her pulse quickening with the weight of her decision. The moment he disappeared from view, she moved quickly, her slippers barely whispering against the hardwood floor. The study was locked, just as she expected. She rattled the handle, frustration flooding her veins. But if she couldn't breach the study, there were other places Harold thought she would never search. His closet, for instance. She entered their bedroom, her heart hammering, and slid the door aside. Rows of suits and jackets hung stiffly, smelling faintly of cedar. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Then, behind a stack of winter coats, she spotted it. A wooden box, small enough to hide yet too carefully placed to be forgotten. Her fingers trembled as she pulled it free and set it on the bed. The lid groaned when she lifted it. Inside lay items that sent the air rushing from her lungs. Daniel's baseball cap, the one he wore the week he vanished. A photograph torn down the middle, leaving only Daniel's half-smile intact. And worst of all, a toy truck. Its once bright paint dulled with time and a dark rusty stain clinging to the edges of its wheels. Margaret staggered back, clutching her chest. This wasn't just memory. These were relics Harold had chosen to keep hidden. She sank onto the bed, staring at the objects as her mind fractured between disbelief and horror. Why would he have these? Why hide them from me for so long? By the time Harold returned, Margaret had restored the box to its place, but her composure cracked like thin glass. Over dinner, her voice betrayed her. "I found something today," she whispered. Harold's fork froze midway. His eyes lifted to hers, calm, calculating. "And what would that be?" "The box," she said, her throat tight. "Daniel's things. You never told me." A long pause. Then Harold exhaled, almost in amusement. "Margaret, you've been carrying this grief for too many years. You see ghosts where there are none. You must have imagined it," her breath caught. "Imagined? I held them in my hands." Harold leaned forward, his tone firm but smooth, like a teacher correcting a child. "Grief plays tricks, darling. You've convinced yourself of something that isn't real." Margaret fell silent, her pulse thundering. Deep down she knew she had not imagined anything. And if Harold was willing to lie so effortlessly now, then perhaps he had been lying all along. The following afternoon, Margaret sat in the kitchen, staring at the steam curling from her untouched tea. Harold had left for his usual walk, but his words from the night before still clung to her. Grief plays tricks. He had spoken with such certainty, as though reality itself bent to his will. For the first time, Margaret feared she was losing her grip, or worse, that Harold wanted her to believe she was. The phone rang, startling her. She hesitated before answering. The voice on the other end carried a weight she recognized instantly, though years had passed. "Mrs. Whitaker." It's Detective Alvarez. Her heart jolted. The man who had once searched for Daniel. The man who had eventually delivered the word unsolved. His voice was older now, roughened by time, but laced with a gravity that pulled her back into that long-ago nightmare. "I shouldn't be calling," he admitted. "I'm retired, but I've never let go of your boy's case. There are things that never sat right with me." Margaret gripped the phone, her breath shallow. "What things?" Alvarez paused, as though debating how much to say. "Your husband's statements. They changed ever so slightly each time we interviewed him. Small details, where he was standing, what he heard. At the time, I chalked it up to stress. But now I wonder." Margaret closed her eyes, the memory of Harold's steady voice before the police flashing through her mind. Too steady, too calm. There was also a neighbor, Alvarez continued. She claimed she saw Harold and Daniel arguing in the yard that evening. We questioned her, but her account was dismissed, said she was confused about the time. Looking back, I'm not so sure she was. Margaret's chest tightened. Harold had never told her about an argument. Alvarez lowered his voice. "I don't mean to cause you pain, ma'am, but I think you deserve the truth. If you ever want to talk, I'll meet you." When the call ended, Margaret remained frozen, the dial tone humming in her ear. Doubt and dread twisted together inside her. For decades, she had built her world on loyalty. Now suspicion cracked its foundations wide open. Upstairs, the floorboards groaned, the sound of Harold moving about. Margaret set the phone down, her hands trembling. If Alvarez was right, then her marriage had never been what she believed. Margaret sat at the edge of their bed that night, her mind a storm of doubts. Alvarez's voice still echoed in her ears, but the creak of Harold's footsteps on the stairs drew her back to the present. He entered the room quietly, his gaze sweeping over her as if he already knew she had been thinking thoughts she shouldn't. "You've been distant," he said, loosening his tie. His voice was calm, almost gentle, but beneath it lingered accusation. "I spoke with someone today," Margaret whispered, unable to stop herself. Detective Alvarez called. "He still thinks about Daniel." Harold's expression shifted, just slightly enough to unsettle her. Then he smiled, thin and deliberate. "After all these years, that man still meddles in our pain." "And you entertained him?" Her throat tightened. "He said your statements never quite matched." Harold stepped closer, placing his hand on her shoulder. His touch, once steadying, now felt like a shackle. "Margaret, my love, haven't we carried enough? You're letting outsiders poison what we've built. For 50 years we've survived because we had each other. Do you want to throw that away?" His words coiled around her like chains. She remembered the vows they had taken, the countless nights she had clung to him through grief. She wanted to believe he was right, that loyalty mattered more than doubt, but then his tone sharpened. "Do you think anyone will believe you over me? A grieving wife who imagines boxes and letters? You've been fragile since the day Daniel disappeared. People will say you've lost your mind." The room seemed to tilt. Margaret's hands shook as she whispered, "I know what I saw, Harold." He knelt before her, forcing her to meet his eyes. "You saw what grief wanted you to see. And if you keep chasing shadows, you'll destroy us both. Is that what you want, to end our lives together in shame?" Tears stung her eyes. The man she had loved was no longer offering comfort. He was wielding love as a weapon, binding her to him with guilt and fear. Margaret turned away, but his grip lingered on her wrist, firm enough to remind her of his strength. "Remember," he said softly, almost tenderly, "without me, you have nothing." That night, Margaret lay awake in silence, feeling the walls close in. Yet even as Harold's words gnawed at her, a sliver of defiance sparked inside. If he wanted her trapped, she would find a way to slip the cage. The next morning, Margaret rose before Harold, her body trembling from another sleepless night. His words, "Without me, you have nothing," still pressed against her chest. But the spark of defiance had not gone out. When Harold left for his errands, she dialed the number Alvarez had left. They met in a quiet cafe on the edge of town, a place far enough that no neighbor would gossip. Alvarez looked older, his hair grayer, his posture more stooped. But his eyes carried the same fire she remembered from those early investigation days. "There's someone you need to hear from," he said, after she confessed Harold's growing strangeness. She came forward years ago, but her statement was buried. "I think it's time you know." Margaret's fingers tightened around her teacup. "Who is she?" Alvarez hesitated, then nodded toward the back of the cafe. A woman in her 60s approached, her face worn, her eyes avoiding Margaret's. She introduced herself as Elaine. "I knew Harold a long time ago," Elaine began, voice barely above a whisper. "Back when Daniel was still a boy. Harold and we had a relationship. It wasn't meant to last, but Daniel found out." Margaret's breath caught. "Daniel?" Elaine nodded quickly. "He saw us together one afternoon. He was upset, said he'd tell you." Harold panicked. "He told me he'd handle it." That night, Daniel disappeared. The cafe seemed to collapse around Margaret. She gripped the table, trying to steady herself. Her mind reeled. Daniel's anger, Harold's calmness, the locked study, the box. Pieces she had kept separate now tangled into a single, unbearable truth. "Why didn't you come forward again?" Margaret demanded, her voice breaking. "I tried," Elaine whispered. "But the police said I was confused." Harold was persuasive. He made sure I stayed silent. Alvarez leaned forward. "Do you see now? This wasn't just tragedy, Mrs. Whitaker. Something deeper happened that night." Margaret stared down at her hands, her wedding band glinting beneath the cafe lights. For nearly 50 years, she had worn it as a symbol of love and survival. Now it felt like an iron shackle. When she returned home, Harold was waiting in the kitchen. His eyes caught hers, sharp and unreadable. For the first time, Margaret feared he already knew where she had been. Harold's stare in the kitchen lingered long after Margaret looked away. She forced herself through the motions of preparing tea, her hands trembling with every clink of porcelain. His eyes seemed to strip her bare, as though he could read the cafe's confession etched across her face. That night, Margaret could not sleep. The shadows of Elaine's words twisted through her mind, overlapping with Alvarez's warning. She replayed Daniel's laughter, his innocence, and then Harold's unnatural calm during those frantic first days. The pieces formed a picture she had refused to see. By morning, she could no longer carry the silence. When Harold entered the dining room, Margaret spoke without turning to face him. "I know about Elaine." The scrape of his chair echoed like thunder. He said nothing at first. Then in a voice flat and cold, "So Alvarez found her." Margaret's breath caught. He hadn't denied it. "Daniel saw you," she whispered, her body shaking. "He threatened to tell me. That's why—" Harold's hand slammed against the table, making the china rattle. "Enough." His face, usually composed, cracked into raw fury. "You don't understand what it was like. A boy with a sharp tongue. A wife who clung to her perfect image of family. Someone had to hold it all together." Margaret staggered back. "Hold it together? He was your son." His voice dropped, controlled again, but the menace remained. "Daniel was going to ruin everything. He hated me for my mistakes and he wanted to destroy us. That night he pushed too far," her mind reeled. "What did you do, Harold?" For the first time, his eyes flickered with something close to weariness. "It wasn't supposed to happen. He confronted me in the yard." Words turned into shoves. "He fell, hit his head on the stone path. I panicked. I thought of you, how you'd never forgive me, how you'd crumble if you knew the truth. So I made it look like he was taken. I staged it. Broken latch, a window left open, and the world believed it." Margaret clutched the back of a chair, her knees buckling. The image of her boy, lifeless, hidden by the man she had trusted above all else, seared itself into her mind. "You let me mourn for years," she said hoarsely. "You let me torture myself believing he was stolen from us." Harold's expression hardened. "I did it for us, Margaret. For you, for the life we still had. If you had known, you would have collapsed. This way we endured." Her stomach turned. Every word, every promise of love over the decades had been built on this horror. Upstairs, the study door loomed in her mind. If Harold had confessed this much, what else lay hidden in the shadows of that locked room? Margaret wiped her tears, her voice trembling but steady. "I need to see for myself." Margaret's footsteps felt like lead as she climbed the stairs. Harold's confession still rang in her ears. Daniel's fall, the staged disappearance, the lie that had carried them through half a century. She reached the locked study door, her hand trembling on the brass knob. Behind her, Harold's voice rose, sharp but weary, as if he had surrendered to exposure. "You won't find peace in there," he called. She turned slowly, meeting his gaze. His face was pale, but his eyes glimmered with something she could only describe as defiance. "You owe me the truth," she whispered. Harold exhaled, stepping closer, his shadow stretching across the dim hallway. "I already told you. Daniel's death was an accident. Everything after it was for us. To protect what we had." Margaret's lips trembled. "Protect? You buried the truth and forced me to carry a lie. You let me cry myself hollow for years while you sat calm, like a man with nothing to grieve." He tilted his head, studying her as though she were a stubborn child. "And yet you survived. Didn't you? You held the house together, you endured. If I had told you, Margaret, you would have broken." "I saved you." Her chest heaved. "You didn't save me. You condemned me to love a ghost, to live with hope that never had a chance. You stole my son and gave me 50 years of lies." Something in Harold's expression shifted. For a flicker, she thought guilt might surface. Instead, he straightened, his voice sharpening. "I did what had to be done. A father provides, a husband protects. Daniel was reckless. He wanted to tear us apart. I couldn't allow it." Margaret's knees weakened, but she steadied herself against the wall. The man before her no longer resembled the husband she thought she had known. He was a stranger wearing Harold's face, a stranger who had convinced her for decades that love was loyalty, and loyalty was silence. Tears blurred her vision. "You talk of protection, but all I see is control. You've twisted love into a weapon. You made me complicit by keeping me blind." Harold's tone softened, but his eyes gleamed with menace. "And still you stayed. You stayed because deep down you knew life without me would be worse. Even now, Margaret, you'll keep my secret, because what else do you have?" His words stabbed deep, but this time they did not shackle her. They burned instead, igniting something new, a resolve she hadn't felt in years. She looked at him, truly looked, and saw not the man she had married but the coffin of lies in which her marriage had long been buried. Her silence unsettled him. Harold shifted, waiting for her denial, her compliance. But Margaret turned away, her tears drying into steel. Downstairs, the phone waited, and with it, Alvarez's number. Margaret stood at the top of the stairs, her hand pressed against the wall to steady herself. Harold's words clung to her like cobwebs. "You'll keep my secret." Because what else do you have? For 50 years, that had been her truth. Now, in the space of a single night, it had become her prison. Downstairs, the telephone waited. The thought of dialing Alvarez's number twisted her stomach. To betray Harold meant tearing apart the last fragile thread of her life, exposing the man she had clung to, as protector, as partner. Yet to remain silent meant condemning herself to live beside the monster he had revealed himself to be. She returned to the bedroom. Harold was already in bed, his breathing steady, almost serene, as though his confession had lifted a burden. Margaret watched him in the dim glow of the lamp. The man she once loved appeared fragile in age, the lines around his eyes deeper, his body weaker. But she knew now that weakness was an illusion. His power had always been control, not strength. Margaret sat in her chair, sleepless. The night stretched long, heavy with ghosts. She thought of Daniel. His laughter, his fierce little temper, his wide, accusing eyes on that last day. She thought of all the birthdays that passed without him, of the hollow anniversaries where Harold played the grieving father, while she carried the grief of a mother. The truth had been buried beneath every word of comfort, every kiss, every whispered vow to endure together. By dawn, her decision solidified. She could not resurrect her son, but she could free his memory from the cage Harold had built. Quietly, she slipped from the room, the phone cold in her hand as she dialed Alvarez. Her voice trembled, but her resolve held. "It's Margaret. You were right. Harold told me everything." Alvarez's silence was heavy before he answered. "Then it's time, ma'am. I'll send them." The hours that followed passed in a blur. Margaret sat at the kitchen table, her wedding ring twisting on her finger until the skin beneath it ached. She thought of taking it off, but her hand would not obey. Perhaps it belonged not to her anymore, but to the decades already lost. When the knock came at the door, the sound was both a mercy and a death knell. Red and blue light splashed across the window panes. Harold descended the stairs, confused at first, then grim. His eyes flicked to Margaret, and for the first time in years she did not look away. "You called them," he said softly, not in anger, but in recognition. Tears welled, but her voice was steady. "For Daniel. For the truth." The officers stepped inside. Harold's hands were pulled behind him, the metallic snap of cuffs sealing the end of 5 decades of silence. Margaret sat motionless, her chest hollow, as dawn broke against the kitchen window. The sirens faded into the distance, leaving the house cloaked in a silence Margaret had never known. She stood in the doorway, her hands pressed to the frame as though she needed the wood to hold her upright. Outside, the early morning sun washed the street in pale gold. Neighbors gathered quietly, their curious faces half hidden behind curtains and hedges. But Margaret did not see them. All she saw was Harold, her husband of 50 years, being led into the patrol car, his wrists bound, his head lowered but not bowed. The door closed with a heavy thud. The engine rumbled and then he was gone. Margaret's knees threatened to buckle, but she stayed standing, trembling from the weight of it all. For decades she had imagined this day differently, the miracle of Daniel's return, the justice of finding his captor. Never once had she pictured it ending this way. Her husband revealed as the architect of their tragedy, her marriage collapsing like ash in her hands. She closed the door softly and leaned against it, her breath shallow. Every corner of the house seemed foreign now. The kitchen where Harold once laughed, the study that had been locked away, the living room portrait of a boy who never grew up. All of it felt poisoned by deceit. Love, she realized, had been her blindfold. She had lived beside a stranger, mistaking silence for strength, control for devotion. Hours passed before she moved again. She found herself walking down the narrow path to the cemetery, clutching her coat against the wind. Her steps were slow, deliberate, each one carrying the weight of years stolen. The cemetery gates groaned as she pushed them open, the morning quiet broken only by the caw of distant crows. Daniel's grave lay beneath an old oak, the stone weathered but still legible. Margaret knelt, her knees sinking into damp earth. She traced her fingers over his name, tears falling silently onto the cold granite. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I should have known, should have seen." Her hands trembled as she reached for her wedding ring. For nearly 50 years it had sat on her finger, the symbol of a love she thought unshakable. Now it felt heavier than iron. With a slow, painful motion she slid it off. The skin beneath was pale, indented, as if marked forever by the weight of loyalty misplaced. She placed the ring carefully on the stone, beside a small bouquet of wildflowers. It gleamed in the weak sunlight, a final offering not of devotion but of surrender. Margaret sat back, her heart hollow yet strangely lighter. She had buried her son once. Now she buried her marriage beside him. Love had not saved her, truth had not healed her, but at last both had been laid to rest. The wind stirred through the oak branches, scattering leaves across the grave. Margaret closed her eyes, letting them fall around her like a requiem.